Okay, so we are on. All right, so welcome everyone. Hopefully you all can hear me. It seems like everyone can hear me. We have a really special guest today, or I guess two guests rather, the two important figures in my life right now. We have Meiko Inaba, who is a longtime resident of Riverside. I know Meiko grew up around, I want to say Gardena in Torrance area and went to UCLA, but moved over to the Riverside area. And I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that. And it was featured in the recent article in the Press Enterprise. And with us to sort of help facilitate this conversation or discussion is a really dear friend of mine, Carol Park, who is also part of the Ethnic Studies Department and is a great classmate of mine, and is also a renowned author, and can be found slaving away at the YOK Center working on all kinds of different projects that I'm sure I will hear about later on tonight. But without further ado, it's such a pleasure having Meiko join us. Meiko has been a really great friend of mine since my matriculation to UCR. And so it is really a great treat. And this is my first sort of lecture, speaking on behalf of the UCR Japanese American community. So I'm really happy to have Meiko come in and sort of give us some insights on her experiences. So without further ado, let's give it a nice sort of round of applause, Zoom style, or even in the classrooms, to welcome Meiko as well. So I'll mute myself, and then Carol and Meiko, you all can take it away.
Thank you so much, Professor Taka, for that great introduction. Yeah, I think that what we're going to talk about today is going to be very fascinating. Meiko, your family history, your husband's family's history as well with the Japanese American incarceration and all that stuff is very fascinating. But also what's fascinating to me is your life and your friendships and how in the past, when we didn't think that friendships could be made between certain communities, you were already doing that with Violet Catherine, right? And different things like that. And so what I want to start us off with is just to ask you really quick, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your experience growing up? I know you yourself were also in the Japanese American incarceration camps, but your experience was positive, and at least I think it was, right?
Yes, for the most part. I was really very, very young. I was, 4 years old when I went to camp. So most of my memories of camp are fun things that you do when you're growing up and you're a kid, and some things that you didn't like doing when you were a kid, like going to school and stuff like that. But for the most part, yes, it was positive. From my parents' standpoint, though, they didn't speak of it too much. So a lot of what I've learned about the camps and what went on are kind of stories I've picked up along the way from family and friends. It wasn't until probably in the 80s that my mom even started to talk about the camps. But yeah, my husband's family and my family, we've been here in the United States for over 100 years. So we go back way back. I moved to Riverside after I got married in 1961. And before that, I grew up basically after camp. I grew up in Gardena, California, where I was exposed to a lot of Japanese and Asian people, mostly Japanese. And it was quite a different story when I came out to Riverside, because there were some Japanese, but they were more in isolated areas. They weren't a community as close as I grew up with Japanese kids. So it was quite a maybe kind of like a reversal for some people, where I went from a lot of almost like moving to another country, I guess,
Yeah. And you've definitely seen the Inland Empire, or the Southern Inland California region, as some folks call it, change over the years. As you said, when you came out initially, there was not a lot of Asian communities. And if there were, we were in our little pockets. But today that has vastly changed, and not just in the inland region, but perhaps in the United States. The Asian American community is the fastest growing community in the United States. So what have you seen since coming out here? I believe it was in the 1960s, right?
Yes. In 60, one thing was when I first moved to Riverside, I remember a cousin telling me how lucky you are to go out to Riverside. You don't have any smog out there. But by the 70s, we had lots of smog and everyone knew Riverside. But, now they've done so much to clean up the air. But I lived out on the farm when I first moved here. So I was pretty much isolated from a lot of community, so to speak. But when I moved up here to the UCR area in 1969, UCR had all of about like 3,000 students. And we used to cut through the campus to go down to the university. We used to walk down. My kids went to Hyatt School up here, and they used to walk down to the UCR for classes. And so just physically it's changed, the population's changed, and I think it's changed for the better.
I would heartily agree with that. Yes. And that sense of community is something that I think we were going to want to talk about a little bit. And I know Professor Taka has brought this up probably in his classes as well, but the sense of community and cohesion that built and grew despite there being such a small population in the beginning, but as it grew, that sense of community strengthened and those bonds were stronger. And one of the things I would love to talk to you about is how your family, the Inabas, and the Kim family were able to surpass these so-called racialized divides, this notion that Japanese Americans and Korean Americans couldn't be friends, but you did not see it that way. And you had a beautiful friendship. Your families were sharing fruits and jams and cookies. And at some point, Catherine was going to the Mochisuki festivals that you were having at the Inaba family farm. So could you talk a little bit about that friendship and just the sense of community?
Well, it started way before the war. My father-in-law met Catherine and her sisters at one of the produce markets. It was the Yamada produce market in Riverside. And they were acquaintances and they talked to each other. They didn't do a lot of socializing, but they did interact. And then after the war, when my in-laws came back to Riverside, they started farming again. And then they ran into each other, at the market again, the produce market. And then they just started to go back and forth. Primarily, the Kim family would come to our farm and gather strawberries and get eggs and things like that. And then they had a small 5-acre plot at their place. So they used to raise some things too. So they would exchange vegetables and fruits and things with each other. And it was just one of those things. They would call on my husband if they needed something done on their place, especially when it came to the heavy tractor work and everything. And then my in-laws would call on them if they needed some extra help delivering something or whatever. But anyway, it just kind of grew from there. And then as they needed more help, my husband and I started doing more with them. And then we just became, closer and closer to, she was like family, because she was the only one left, Catherine. She was the one I really got to know.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the beautiful thing. And a quick side note so that Professor Taka's students will know who Catherine Kim was. She's actually the descendant of the original Insu Kim, one of the original founders and residents of Pachapa Camp, the first Koreatown in the United States, right there in Riverside. And so she was one of the last of that Korean community that lived and died in Riverside. So it's quite an amazing story. And that, Meiko, you had such a beautiful friendship. I think this is what historians and students and teachers sometimes forget to think about, those details, those friendships that did exist, like you were saying, the exchanges between your family and the Kim family, how they would come over and pick strawberries and pick eggs. And I think at some point you showed me a recipe, right, of a cookie recipe or something. Yes.
That was Lucy Kim's sugar cookie recipe. And anyone who came out to the farm got sugar cookies because the cookie jar always had sugar cookies in it.
That's fantastic. And I think that's just the beautiful thing that in our conversation, I hope that the students that are listening to this will understand and feel is that even though this may have been, 1960s and 70s, this was just the other day, right? We can just think about this happening a few years ago, and those relationships were there, and they carry forward as we exist now in this time, as our communities continue to be more diverse and as our Asian American population continues to grow. But I know, Meiko, as well, you have so much insight as to how things have changed. We've been talking about it in the Riverside community, but I wonder if I might ask you about what you have now seen since coming out here in Riverside, but since the 1960s, how our country too may have been changing, evolving, or in your eyes, how has it grown with the Asian American community? How has it not?
It surprises me, especially when I saw it in the statistics about how much the Asian community has grown here. I remember back in the 80s, we had Japanese American Citizens League installation dinner. And we had a sociologist from UCLA come out, and he was with one of the first people to start with an Asian studies program over there. And he was talking about the migration of Asians in Southern California and how few of us there were out here in the Inland Empire compared to the LA area. And he says, it's going to take a while, but they're not going to come all the way out to the Inland Empire. They're going to probably go south at the 15. And that's where they took the turn, and they are going down, the migration of the Asians from LA and even from Asia. So that's been interesting to follow from what he had said was going to happen, and it truly has been. The other thing is, some things change and some things never change, because there's always the people that presume that because we've got the Asian faces that we're not American. And that to this day really kind of galls me sometimes when people make that assumption, especially when they say, well, how long have you lived here? And I say, all my life. And the longer it goes on, it has more meaning, because I've gotten a lot older since I first started hearing that phrase, how long have you lived here? So those kinds of things don't change. But I think some people, they don't even see the differences anymore.
Yeah.
When you meet new people and you make acquaintances, I think they don't see the colors.
Yeah.
And that makes me feel good.
That's great to hear. Yeah, I would say I would agree with you that the continued racialization of the Asian American community, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, we did see a huge increase in anti-Asian hate crimes and just racism against our community. And so it's very telling to hear you say that you heard this before, back in the 70s and the 60s and before, and that you continue to still hear it today. So it's something that I think we as a community, as scholars, right, as leaders, as students, we just need to be thinking about how this is continuing, and that you are saying it to us now. How can we change that? Because while some people have looked at us and said, okay, I don't see that anymore, there is still that other side that continues to racialize us. So I think that's a very telling point that you've made. And yes, it hits home for me as well.
Well, I come from a Japanese background, and so the Japanese in America have tended to outmarry more than any Asian group. And so we're diluting ourselves, so to speak. But anyway, I think with Asians kind of getting together and coming together as Asians, we could probably accomplish quite a bit that we can't individually. And I want us to all retain our own, culture and all that, because I think it's important we do that. But for some things, I think we really need to get together and not discriminate against each other within our own Asianness.
I 100% agree with you on that. And that you bring that up, I might want to touch a little bit then on, I believe you are involved in the Japanese American Citizenship League. And I know you all just had your big annual meeting in believe it was Las Vegas. Yes. But could you talk a little bit about the JACL, perhaps its history or what the work has been and what you've done? I know you guys did the festivals, right, in Riverside, and
In Riverside,
a lot of actions. Yes.
And I think different chapters throughout the United States over the years have kind of taken different perspectives on how they wanted to be active in the community. There were the civil rights groups, and then there was the ones that wanted to do the cultural aspects of it. And some of them were really lucky. They were able to combine everything and present, culture and civil rights and, social justice and all of that all combined. And I think when JCL started years ago, it was a matter of taking pride in being an American. And there have been different times over its history where there have been Japanese people who have agreed and disagreed with them. During the war, there were people that we were interned in the camps, and people accused the JCL of selling out the Japanese, saying we should go and be, accept this as fate, so to speak. And then so there were those that said, no, we shouldn't go. And so there was a divide at one time. And I think over the years, they've kind of come to accept each other and, so it's evolved. I think right now it's really headed into the social justice, civil rights, that kind of thing. And I think that's what we need to keep going. And they've also been making a lot of connections with it used to be the Organization of Chinese Americans, but I think they changed their name. I can't remember. OCA. And then there are other Asian groups and then they're also even with the Black groups, So I think we're making our message go out further by uniting with groups.
Yes, and I think that's great. This idea of building community together, of building relationships with the different organizations. I know we have the Black Lives Matter movement, we have JACL, we have the different Asian Americans Advancing Justice League, and all these different organizations. I think you're absolutely right that over the years we have evolved, that the Asian American community has begun to really truly think about how these relationships can change how we are racialized and say enough is enough. Because like you were saying with JACL, we may not agree with each other in our own communities at times, but we do agree on one thing, that we should not be racialized, that we should not be marginalized. And how we go about doing that is important by being able to work with one another and other communities, right? Other ethnic communities. And I think you said something very wonderful, Meiko, earlier, that we should keep our heritage, our ethnic heritage, while recognizing at the same time that we are also American. And I like that very much. Some people may not, some people may do, but I very much like that you said that. And I know, again, you said your family has been here for 100 years and you have such a great history here. Where do you now think that, or how would you say you would see now the trajectory or the path now for the future of Japanese Americans and Asian Americans? Where do you think we should go or might go?
I would like to see us keep going the way we are right now. And even then, I think it's still about getting the message out about our history, because there's so much of America that doesn't know the Asian history. And I mean, all Asians, and I mean, even on the West Coast, I think some of us are a little behind some of the Asian groups that have moved into the East or to the South. and we don't have as much exposure. Although living in Southern California, I think we have the best, of both worlds. We have the influx of a lot of immigrants from Asia, and so we see a lot of them.
Yes.
But I think it's a matter of getting that word out of what happened with our history, and not just that Japanese American history, but all Asian histories, and letting the good things go forward and reminding people of bad things that have happened in the past that shouldn't be happening and we don't want to forget about, so they don't happen again. Because a lot of these things can happen to non-Asians too. When you think about how many other minorities, because everyone in the United States at one time or another was a minority, because we're all immigrants, except the Native Americans, but everyone else came from somewhere else. So we have to just kind of take into account, we have to respect each other and enjoy each other's qualities.
That's amazing. I think you're 100% right. That's fantastic, fantastic advice for where we should go in the future. You said something also, again, just now, I think that's very important as well. This notion of understanding our history. I 100% agree with you on that. I think that if we don't know our history, we are on shaky ground, to quote Professor Edward T. Chang. And I think that, we miss a lot of that wonderful Asian American history. And one of the things I think Professor Taka is also an expert in as well, and you know a lot about, is a piece of Asian American history there in Riverside, which is the Harada House. And just how important of a structure, a symbol, a historical landmark, because it is a historical landmark, a U.S. National Historic Landmark, it is. Would you talk about a little bit about that? So for those students who don't know what the Harada House is, and maybe talk about what you've seen it become?
So Harada House was the house that Mr. Harada bought because he wanted his children to live in a healthy environment. He had been living with his families in a boarding house. And when he bought the house on Lemon Street, the neighbors were not too happy with it because he was of Japanese descent. And so some neighbors in the area decided that they would take him to court and say he couldn't legally buy the property because he had bought the property in his children's name, because he could not legally own the property. But he had children who were American citizens and they could legally own the property. So some of the neighbors took him to court and sued to say he can't buy that property. Well, he won. The California Supreme Court said no, he was right, and so they were able to keep their home. That house has become kind of symbolic because I know of so many other areas that case history touched, upon, because years later, after the war and everything, when families had property and it was bought in the children's name, sometimes it was bought in the oldest one's name or whatever. But anyway, there would be a question on who's legally the owner of that property was. Well, if the children were American, were Americans, they could own it. So it had far-reaching implications. And I think it came to be a symbol. But not only that, the Harada family were so prominent in the Japanese community here. And I think to a certain extent within the American community, just in Riverside, because they had the business on downtown, the Washington restaurant. And then the family that lived there, I became acquainted with them because my family was a good friend. I mean, my husband's family were good friends with the Haradas. And I got to know Sumi, who lived there continuously after the house was, bought. And then after they left for camp during the war years, and she came back. And it became a kind of a haven for people who were coming back from the camps that had nowhere else to go. She boarded them at their house until they could find a place to stay. And she was fortunate, the Haradas were fortunate. They had a friend in Jess Stebler who took care of the house for them while they were gone. And so I think when the family donated the house to the city of Riverside, because by that time it was already a national landmark, already been designated that. We really feel strongly that it's really got a place in our history. And I think it's the story of a lot of immigrants to the United States from all over the world. They're immigrants, they're coming, they want a place to have a better life for their children. And so what you have to do to make that happen. And I think it still goes on to this day. All the new immigrants that are coming here, they're looking for new lives, so to speak, to better their lives for their children. So,
Yeah, it's an amazing story. And I think you're 100% right. Again, that indeed, this country is made up of immigrants, and that story is told over and over again, that we are always looking to better our lives, our children's lives, right? And to have those opportunities. And the Harada House is a representation of that. With, like you said, they had that wonderful business, the Washington Restaurant there in downtown Riverside, that they were able to fight for their home and keep it is phenomenal. And that it became this symbolic representation of just being able to succeed in that way and say, no, we are here. We are American. We are also Japanese, but we are also here doing this, what we wanted to do, have those opportunities. And I know today, the much of the Harada House's contents, including Sumi's papers, books, and notes, are now housed at the Riverside Museum. And I know Professor Taka has looked through those materials extensively, but what an amazing story. Just this notion of them writing on the wall, the time that they were being, incarcerated and taken, and then Sumi returning to that very spot. It's a fascinating story. And I know that Mitz, your husband, also, his father was incarcerated as well. And again, that the connectedness that you all had and being able to surmount those difficulties. It's amazing.
I don't know if it was Riverside. In some ways, I think Riverside was unique because my husband, the Inaba family, they had their farm out in West Riverside, which is now Kurupa Valley. And during the war, they had an American white family that took care of their farm while they were gone. If they hadn't taken care of it, who knows what have happened to it. But, there were people, even if they were saying they put us away for our own good during the war, there were so many people that were helping us too on the outside.
Right. Yeah, there was definitely that sense of community and a bond between those members of the communities. Didn't matter what your ethnicity was. And that's the beautiful thing I think you're pointing out. And again, that sometimes historians and teachers and academics don't always remember to mention. So this is a wonderful thing to hear, that is happening, that happened before, and it will continue to happen. So just an amazing story there. I think if there's any questions, I'm not sure of the time. Do we have more time, Professor Taka?
Yeah, I think we're at 6 o'clock. So we have about 15 minutes before the Q&A, but, it's up to you, how you want to facilitate.
I just want to mention to the students that they have here, one of the things is if you have family, friends, whether they're born and raised here in America, from the old country or wherever, talk story with your family. Learn about their history. Some people want to leave their history behind because my parents wouldn't talk to us about a lot of things about the war years and everything. And I kind of regret not having forced the issue, so to speak, or taught. But yeah, that's a good way for you not to forget your history, and so that other people don't forget the history that has gone on.
That's a wonderful piece of advice. And yeah, students, you can definitely do oral histories, record, of course, ask for permission. Don't just don't just start recording mom and dad. They might get mad, but yeah, definitely talking to your family is one way to record those histories, to get those histories, and to never forget what happened before. And I think, Meiko, that's just a very telling point that you have been making throughout our conversation, is that we shouldn't forget our histories. We shouldn't forget our ethnic identities, and we shouldn't forget the good and the bad, that we should think about them both, because if you don't, you're only going to focus on one thing and you miss everything else. So that this is wonderful. Is there anything else? I know you just told us, talk to your parents, but is there anything else that you wanted to talk about before we open it up to Q&A to the audience? I'm sure there's a lot and I don't want to run out of time.
I just wanted to throw out there, you had mentioned that the Kims started to come to our Mochitsuki, the annual festival that we would have within the family, of making the Japanese rice cakes for New Year's. But after we sold the farm in 1992, I think it was, she welcomed us at her place because she had 5 acres. So we started doing our Mochitsuki at Catherine's place. And we continued to do that until 2018, I think it was.
Wow. Will you have another Mochitsuki festival now that?
Well, we had one in my backyard in 2019, just before COVID hit. And we haven't had one since. So, but I've passed the baton on to my children because it's too much work for me. And
yes, it does take a lot.
Up to them to carry it on if they want. But COVID hasn't let us take that on at this point in time.
Oh, well, that's an amazing tidbit that you just shared with us, that Catherine welcomed you to the farm to continue the Mochitsuki festival. It's just a wonderful way, again, of showing that community bonds, again, surpass any kind of notions of racialization, notions of separations, notions of all these things that you hear about, right? You know, and people talk about, but in actuality, there were friendships, there were relationships, there were these bonds that tied our communities together despite our ethnic backgrounds. And I think that's just a beautiful thing. And your friendship with Catherine is a testament to that. So, wow, I applaud you for that. Let's open it up, though. I'm sure students have many, many questions, thoughts, comments, concerns. Please unmute yourselves, or you can type it into the chat, or if you're there live, you can raise your hand, I think, and Professor Taka will call on you and we can get going with that. We have one in the chat. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, so I will just say Mr. Mondragon, Miss Mondragon is asking, has your definition of being an American changed? Great question. And this was directed to Meiko.
I don't think so. I mean, I grew up, you know, being taught that I'm an American. I was born in America, an American, and what obligations that goes with being born here. I mean, just being born here doesn't mean you're going to be a good citizen. You know, you've got an obligation to America, just as, you know. So I don't think it's really changed, because I think we have Americans that have come over here and have, you know, gone through the citizenship process and become citizens. Those that have been born here. And so I think, other than the fact that it takes more than just being born or going through the citizenship process to be an American, there's an obligation to give back to the community.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much for that question. We have another question, but it was a private one, so I will just read the question from a student. What was the relationship between the Chinese American community and the Japanese American community? Was there friendships there?
I don't recall. Early in the 60s, when I came here, I wasn't aware of a big Chinese community. I knew of a few Chinese families, but they were like friends, like any other friends we had. You know, they weren't friends because they were Chinese, or we didn't do things with them just because they were Chinese. Our, you know, our kids went to school together, that kind of thing. But I don't remember, I think it might have been in the late 90s, early 2000s, that I started hearing more about the Chinese population growing here. I knew through UCR, there were Chinese and Japanese professors and students, you know, that had come here. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was a small Chinese American community there in Riverside as well. I believe it was in downtown, and then they moved it, right?
Oh, the Chinatown, the old
Chinatown.
Yeah.
Yes.
But see, by the time I came in the 60s, it
was gone.
I'd almost gotten lost, you know.
Yeah.
Until the Save Our Chinatown got a hold of, which I give them lots of credit for what they've done.
Yeah, yeah. There's a movement in Riverside, to the person who asked that question privately, to preserve the other Chinatown that existed in Riverside. So there was a Chinese American population in Riverside, and there's historic evidence for it. There's photographs, you name it, and there's a committee that is actually trying to preserve that. And so they're doing the best they can, but politics is politics. But thank you so much for that question. We have another question in the chat from Mudra Vyas. What's the toughest part of trying to improve Asian equality in Riverside? Is it tough to do that? That's a good question.
Well, when I think back, I worked for the county of Riverside, and I went to work for them in '73, about the time affirmative action was, you know, in the forefront and taking off, especially in the public sector and everything. And when you talk about equality, they were trying to push for population parity so that the county of Riverside in its workforce had parity with the population in the community. Well, our community was so small, we could hardly measure. So, I mean, we have one or two people that work for us, and in the Asian, you know, then they say, well, okay, we've got enough. So then we didn't have to go beyond our parity. If it happened, it was fine. But yeah, that was that situation. I remember being very, very disappointed that just because we meet our goals, you know, so to speak, that it's okay to go over your goal. But, you know, yeah. I don't know. I think you have to be aware of things that are going on where prejudice pops up or those kinds of things. If it's not brought to the forefront, it can't be addressed. Because I remember every once in a while, our JCL, our chapter here, would get requests from people in the community to help them address issues that were going on, either in the workforce or in their community or something. But I think the thing of it is, it has to be brought up, because we can't fix it if we don't know it's broken.
So we got to speak up. That's a very fair statement indeed. While people are still thinking of more questions, I have a fun question for you. Some time ago, we had lunch, and you had mentioned, I think one of your grandchildren was very much into BTS, right?
No, I'm into BTS.
Oh my, yes. I love it. I mean, and this is the beautiful thing, right? With the globalization and technology, you know, with the internet, TikTok, all these different things, social media platforms, we are more connected now than we have ever been, ever. And we will continue to be that way. But I wonder, over the years, we have seen this fascination with Asian Americans and then just Asian culture just explode. Back in the 70s and the 80s, it was martial arts, the whole karate thing, right? You know, and most recently we had this whole thing with the Karate Kid, right, hitting Netflix, and just this just this huge explosion of interest in Asian culture, Asian food, Asian identity, Asian arts. You've seen this all this time change, evolve. What do you think about this? I mean, I think it's a good thing. Some people say, actually, no, it's some sort of weird cultural appropriation, but everybody's entitled to their opinion. But I wonder, what has your experience been? What do you think?
I love it. I really love it. And I think it has a lot to do with, Netflix, YouTube, all of that kind of stuff. But I would have never gotten exposed to a lot of that stuff. And, BTS and my that just draws me. It's another connection I have with my grandkids, other than the blood lineage. We have interests in common. And I think it's keeping me young and aware of what's going on. Because otherwise I could have been sitting here not knowing about BTS, K-pop, K-dramas, or even Mando Pop, or and some of those other. And I'm just loving all this Asianness that I'm finding more and more of. My background is being Japanese, and so I'm familiar with the Japanese culture and everything. But I think the other thing that it points out is how interconnected all the Asian countries can be. How we've been friendly at times, and they've been at enemies, at odds. How one country's taken over another country at different times. And it really makes you think about how we can stay more peaceful with each other. And anything that will bring you together is fine with me.
Oh, that's a great way of looking at that. Wow, Meiko, that's very insightful. I would say, yeah, you're right. It is a great way to keep peaceful relationships, because we understand each other more, because we're seeing each other's cultures, we're seeing each other's identities, and sharing food. That's the other thing too, is that we're seeing a lot of Asian foods become popular, become mainstream, like the bulgogi taco, this fusion of Korean and Mexican food. Pho is a big thing, right? Everybody loves pho. If I say pho, 99% of people are like, yes, that's really good. And that's a Vietnamese dish. So you're right. I think anything that brings us together, you're absolutely right, helps us understand one another and keeps that peace, so that we don't have to have those kinds of misunderstandings, because that does happen. And we do have conflicts, and we do have misunderstandings, and we do have these, ill-conceived misconceptions of one another that have no grounds in anything. So being able to watch K-dramas, K-pop, or being able to watch anime, manga, any of these different things, you're right. It definitely connects us. There's a bond there. I'm going to turn it back again to the audience here, to the students. Are there any questions? Here we got one here in the chat from Steele Ike. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the names again. Steele asks, when talking about interethnic relationships and marriages, you use the word dilute. Did that have a certain stigma behind it among the Asian American community? If so, has that changed in any way over the years? So there is that kind of misperception of, right, a stigma of out marrying, but have you seen that change, the stigma?
I think more than a stigma, well, there was a stigma, and then the legal aspects too. At one time it was illegal totally.
Right, the anti-miscegenation laws.
There was always the stigma that, the families didn't want, intermarry. I remember when I started dating in the 50s, I would not date a non-Japanese because I would be afraid to take the person home, because it was just not acceptable in my, community, so to speak. Now I think it's great. I have no problem with intermarriage and everything. I just hope that when, groups that intermarry, sometimes you end up taking one culture over the other. And I've seen it happen, among family, because sometimes they'll retain that Japanese culture, and sometimes they won't. The best ideal is when they can mix the two and, integrated. I think it's great. Yeah. So I think it's being more and more accepted. And I know my grandkids take pride in their being Hapa.
Mhm. Yeah, it's definitely changed over the years. You're absolutely right, Meiko. There were anti-miscegenation laws that prevented the intermarriage of different communities, and that didn't change until what was I don't even remember the year, but 19. Yeah, I can't remember the exact year, but
This
yeah,
area of the country you were in. Yeah.
right. And it's something to very much think about, that this is a very fairly recent thing, right? That being able to marry the person you love, right, despite their ethnic background, was a fairly recent privilege, or privilege as they call it, a recent right given to us, right? We should be able to marry who we love, no matter the person's background or ethnic heritage. But that was a very interesting, good question as well there. We do have another question in the chat. It comes from Brianna Lone. This is an interesting question. I was wondering what you think about the later generations and how they might feel that there is a lack of connection with their heritage because they are quote unquote American. For example, not being able to speak their native language well. So there's this idea that young folks like I'm not as young as I used to be, but young folks like us and the students are not as connected to our heritage because we don't speak the language. Perhaps we were just raised speaking only English, and so there might be a lack of connection there. And I'm going to tack on to this question and say, if there is that lack of connection, how might we then be able to reconnect? Is there a way to do that?
Well, I grew up where my father was from Japan. He was a first generation, so he grew up speaking Japanese. He learned his English when he came to America. My mother was born and raised in America. She spoke English all her life. But after the war and during the war, we did not speak, they didn't speak Japanese to us for a long time. They would speak to each other in Japanese, but not to us because they wanted us to become American. Then somewhere along the line, someone said you should send your children to Japanese school. So I did get sent to Japanese school for a couple of years. But then, your other things in your life keep going on and other things take priority. So we quit going to Japanese school. And I kind of regret not having the ability to speak Japanese very well. My husband and I were able to go to Japan and get ourselves around Japan with our limited Japanese. So I was able to speak a lot more Japanese before because my in-laws spoke Japanese primarily. And when I had to use it all the time, it came very easily. But now don't ask me to speak Japanese because I don't use it. So I think I've lost a lot of it. But I don't necessarily think that just because you can't speak the language that you can't keep the culture.
That's a very good point. Yes, you can always research the history, right? And see the different aspects of that, the culture, the food, like we were just saying, the music, the people, the traditions. There's ways to still access your history, your heritage, and your culture, even if you can't speak the language. It's a very good point, Meiko. Yes, thank you for that question, Brina. Are there any other questions from the live audience as well, or in the chat? If not, I'll just keep asking questions, but
I have a question, I guess, since if it's okay with everyone. You mentioned like food, and obviously I think it's maybe that time of day, so we're all really hungry. But you mentioned like meeting, Catherine Kim at a produce market and whatnot, or at least your folks did, and was wondering how was it? How did you all access like Japanese food, like some of like the staples? You have the rice, the soy sauce, etc. Like, how did you access those things? In a particular era where I don't think there were, a bunch of 99 ranches and H Marts and Mitsuwas just sort of sprinkled all over Southern California, and especially in Riverside, because you don't really have a lot of that access. So just out of curiosity, how was that like? What was there like a sushi restaurant or even like
No.
like around? Like how did you all get that fixed? Because I know we are all addicted to our foods. And I think Riverside has a good selection, or kind of now, but just out of curiosity.
It's come a long ways. I grew up in Gardena, so we had Japanese markets and things we used to shop at. So I come out to Riverside, there is no market or anything, not even a Chinese market, But we used to have the fish man come out to the farm once a week. And he used to come in this big panel truck, and the back was filled with ice, and he carried all kind of fish and tofu. And then he would take orders for rice and canned goods and things like that, that he would bring back the following week. So he was our source of Japanese food. And he would take orders for mochi during, New Year's time and things like that. So that was our primary connection, although we used to go visit my folks. And so when we made our run into Gardena, we used to make a run to the Japanese markets there before we came home to Riverside. But that was one of the things when I was talking to the reporter about in that article about we need more of us out here, because that context came out of businesses out here and commercial establishments that cater to the Asian taste. We were saying that it would be neat if we could have an H Mart or Yao. Well, they don't have Yaohan anymore, but some of the big Japanese or Chinese markets, although 99 Market came into Corona. So yeah, we just needed to have more of us out here for the commercial people to say, okay, it's going to be worth it to bring in some, the store or whatever, the business out here.
More students need to stay here and in Riverside, and we can start a revolution of Asian markets to be built here, I guess, in Riverside.
There's an interesting point to make about that. Historically in Riverside, the Chinatown community was, before it moved to its second location, was closer to the Japanese American and the Korean American communities. And actually the Koreans would go to the Chinatown and exchange things with them for things like soy sauce and rice and whatnot. So there was a community exchange historically in the early 1900s. We're talking like 1907, 1908, they would do this. And if you go to the UC Riverside Library, you'll actually find a record book in Catherine Kim's archive where they show that there was an exchange of goods. It's fascinating, but yeah, the food is what connects us, definitely. And if we could have more of that in Riverside, that would be great.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think those are some really good points. You did mention that UCR does have Catherine Kim's collection. I think it's important that we house these sort of important historical sort of historical items, historical sort of records at these different facilities. So yeah, we have them here at UCR, which is which I think I'm very grateful for my own particular research. But you also have the Mine Okubo, sort of artist who grew up in Riverside as well. There's a whose collection is also housed in downtown Riverside and also the Museum of Riverside. So we have a lot of Asian American community sort of archival materials and collections here right in our backyard. And I think that and especially with folks like Meiko and Carol who are sort of continuing on that tradition, I think it's really important for all of us to be cognizant of the fact that there's a lot here to offer. I think we get kind of sidestepped with like Los Angeles, San Francisco, but Riverside was one of those first when we were talking about labor, right, and then sort of this labor force, the citrus market, the citrus and fruit labor force that was out here in Riverside. We saw a lot of community come together, especially with the Korean American community, with the Chapa Camp, and also with the Harada House and with the Save Our Chinatown movement. So I think it's just really important for us to sort of be aware of the local history that is here to offer. And there is I think a walking tour. I know there was one. I know at one point where you can kind of go to these different sites. So I was hoping that maybe that could be somewhat of a start to kind of, you know, galvanize the community. There used to be the Sendai Festival, which I know Meiko's late husband used to run as well. So there's a lot of different communal, you know, sort of history here that I hope that, you know, we can engage more with, and not to think of these things as these like meta sort of historical narratives, but actually are part of our own local history here. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to bring Meiko and Carol to our class as guest speakers. So, you know, I think we have like room for maybe one more question if we have a question from the classroom.
And before we do that though, I just want to note that the Catherine Kim archive was generously donated by Meiko. So it's because of her that exists, that we are able to access this history. So thank you to Meiko for that. And the second thing I wanted to note was that the Riverside walking tours will be back. I happen to be on that board that helps to organize it. We just kind of disappeared because of COVID, the pandemic, but do keep an eye out for that. But yes, one more question. Anyone? Thoughts, comments, concerns? Got 3 minutes. Or we can have final closing words from Meiko, if there's anything else you wanted to say or talk about before we hop off.
Well, I just appreciate being given the opportunity to come and speak to the group today. And as I said before, Carol, you and Professor Taka, you're the ones who keep me young. I've got to keep associating with you young people.
Thank you. We love you.
Thank you, Meiko, for coming through. Meiko's a great friend. You know, I think I got one of the comments early on was like, Meiko, you're not like the typical Asian grandmother. I don't know how to take it for all other grandmothers, I think, but I think it's in a compliment. So I think we all appreciate your guidance and your kind words, and obviously, you know, we look forward to having lunch with you again next week, possibly. So we'll be in touch in our group chat. And but yeah, I'm gonna start the recording now. And then what we'll do